Us to begin our Bible class, ask you to take your seats, please.
John 4.
Yeah, it's time for it. In fact, we're a little bit late getting started, of course, because of other announcements and activities.
It's getting better every day.
Thank you, Brandon. In our class, in this session, we're going to be studying one of my favorite stories in all of the accounts of the gospel of Christ. I want you to imagine it in this way. Two strangers meet each other late in the evening. We do not know the name of one of them. We know the name of only the other. He was a Jew. She was a Samaritan. She was therefore a woman, a female. He was Jesus, a male. And that is germane to the story itself. It is germane to the culture that they lived in at that time. They met at a well about 30 miles north of Jerusalem. It was a well that was dug by Jacob. Jacob gave a plot of land to his son Joseph, and Jacob had a well dug. There were wells that were multiple around that area. We do not know what prompted him to dig it other than maybe to take care of his family and his cattle and so on, and the needs that would be there. Joseph had asked before dying in Egypt, that when they left Egypt, that his remains would be moved back to his land. So not far from this well, there is the tomb of Joseph. Not far from this well, maybe a half mile, but more likely around a quarter of a mile, just a nice little walk, there was a little city. You could call it a city. It was actually just a small community named Sychar. Traveling with Jesus on this occasion were his apostles and maybe some others that were in that entourage. We do not know the precise time of their departure headed for Samaria. But even if they left only at noon, they've been walking for about 6 hours. They may have left as early as we would say, the crack of dawn. We just do not know. But in that part of the country, in the time of the year that we believe that this took place, the land was usually very dry, even parched, and it would take its toll upon those who would be walking in that sun. And the New Testament tells us that it was the 6th hour. Now, if you interpret that in the Jewish terms, that would have been 12 o'clock. Still a hot time of the day, and they would have been walking along. But the consensus among Bible scholars who have studied it thoroughly is that it would be a reference to Roman time, and therefore it would be 6 p.m. toward the end of the day. So it would be understandable and it would be sensible to conclude Jesus was tired, he was hot, and he was thirsty. And I want to bring something to your attention before I pursue the study of the text itself. In Mark's and Matthew's and Luke's accounts, they tell us things about Jesus that John doesn't tell us. And I've mentioned that to you before. It's wise to keep in mind that there are 4 different accounts, and each of them tells things that the other one doesn't, but then there are things that all 4 of them tell. But one of the distinguishing marks of John's epistle, or his account of the gospel, is that he tells us things about Jesus physically that are not told by the others. He's the only one of the 4 that records Jesus saying, "I'm thirsty." Do you know the other one? It was on the cross. And they had some sour wine mixed with vinegar that was given to him. When he took a drink of it, parched his parched lips being wetted with it, and that's when he died. He said, "I'm thirsty." And they gave it to him. In this case, he sits down, the Bible says, beside this well. And he looks and he sees a woman. Now, let's pause for a second. We're not talking about the United States of America in 2023. We're talking about a time when women were not given the regard and the respect and the treatment that they should have been given. They were treated basically in that period of time, including the Jews, as a piece of property. Women were not elevated to the estate that they deserved. Socrates is on record as having prayed, and he would boastfully tell you that he prayed it daily, that he was thankful that he was not born a slave or a woman. Now, that seems to me in that time, especially knowing that the rabbis of the Jews had decreed that a man was not supposed to talk to a woman on the street or publicly, including his wife. Just don't talk to them. Now, the reason I bring that extreme example up to you, or that radical illustration up to you, is this. When Christ sat down by that well, and he looked and he saw that woman coming, and she has that pot, maybe on her shoulder, maybe on her head. She has that pot, she's coming to get water. Do you think he thought for a moment about not talking to her? I don't. regardless of what the custom was, regardless of what the rabbis had decreed, regardless of what their cultural trends were, Christ valued all human beings equally. And one of the great things about Christianity is that historically, women have been elevated in all societies where Christianity has gone, as they should be. In fact, I will say tongue in cheek, may be elevated above men. Because when I introduce my wife occasionally, I'll say, you hear her talk about the better half, shake her hand. She is the better half. Literally true. But there is a deeper sense in which that trait was illustrated by Christ. He was still God in the flesh. And as God in the flesh, he could know things about men without even asking. And we have examples of that, and we'll study some of those as we continue through this study of the life of Christ. So when he looked up and saw that woman, he saw a soul for which he came to die. And he did not hesitate to engage her in a conversation publicly. Let's read about it. John 4, beginning at verse 1. Therefore, when the Lord knew that the Pharisees had heard that Jesus made and baptized more disciples than John, though Jesus himself did not baptize but his disciples, he left Judea and departed again to Galilee. But he needed to go through Samaria. Now, pause in your reading for a moment. In a greater context, Jesus has learned by this point that John the Baptist has been arrested, that he's in prison. But Jesus also knew that John had done a considerable amount of evangelistic work in Samaria, and very fruitfully. It was a fruitful area where people would listen. Christ had been doing a lot of work in Judea. Remember, and I'll illustrate it simply in the absence of a graphic here. Just hold my hand up. And that hand of mine, disproportionately, of course, but to that land that we know as the Bible land, some call it Palestine, but you know it's divided into three primary areas. The southern part, Judea, where Jerusalem is, and then the middle part is Samaria, and the northern part is Galilee. All three of them bounded on the east by the Jordan River and bounded on the west by the Mediterranean Sea. Jesus was in Judea. He's in that southern part. And going north to Galilee, particularly in light of the fact that John the Baptist is not able to be out there preaching right now. So Jesus, it says, had to go through Samaria. And it's intriguing that it's worded that way, because we know from secular history that there were times when those who were Jews would be traveling north, and rather than go through Samaria, they would go east, cross over the Jordan River, and then go north until they got past Samaria and then cross over the Jordan again and come back west into Galilee. Why would they do that? Because the Jews and the Samaritans did not like each other. And I'm understating it. There was a deep, strong animosity between them. And they would do anything to keep from going through the country they lived in. Now, the woman will say to Jesus, as we'll read in a moment, she'll say, you know, the Jews, they don't like to associate with us. Well, truthfully, as Brother J.W. McGarvey cites in his excellent volume on the fourfold gospel, they would trade with them. They would do business with them, in other words. In fact, while Jesus is talking to this woman, remember his disciples are in Sychar buying from them. So they would do business with them, but they did not want to socialize with them. And that is deep-seated in a bit of history, so let me take a moment to give you the background of that. Way back over 700 years earlier, the Assyrians invaded the northern kingdom. When the kingdom was divided between northern kingdom, the southern being Judea, and the northern kingdom, Israel. And Israel had departed from God's ways to the extent that God allowed the Assyrians to invade them and bring punishment upon them because they had gone into idolatry and so on. So the Assyrians marched in and they overthrew that northern kingdom and carried the majority of them off into captivity. Not all of them. The Bible tells us there were some that remained. But then the Assyrians imported those who were Gentiles. And the Gentiles at that time would have been people that would have been primarily given to idolatry. They were not good people. And in time, some of those Gentiles married some of those Samaritans that were left. And in that intermarrying, it was just sort of like a slap in the face to the Jews. And how dare them do that? Well, it may have started out at a low simmering point, shall we say, but it got really hot later on, early, because they just despised each other and they didn't want to associate with each other. That was the circumstance. And like I said, not all Jews, but many of them would choose to travel an extra couple of days just to go east, up, and then back west to avoid going through Samaria. It didn't bother Jesus, because he didn't come to die for those in Galilee and Judea only. He came to die for the Samaritans as well. So when that woman started toward him, that did not cause him to have pause at all. Now let's resume our reading. Verse 4, but he needed to go through Samaria. So he came to a city of Samaria, which is called Sychar, near the plot of ground that Jacob gave to his son Joseph. Now Jacob's well was there. Jesus, therefore, being wearied from his journey, sat thus by the well. It was about the 6th hour. A woman of Samaria came to draw water. Jesus said to her, "Give me a drink." for his disciples had gone away into the city to buy food. Then the woman of Samaria said to him, how is it that you, being a Jew, ask a drink from me, a Samaritan woman? Wait a minute now, let's think about this. She doesn't even know who he is. But she said, you're a Jew. How? Well, maybe by the dress, because they all had their customs in dressing. Maybe by language. I think I've told you before, I don't remember whether I have or not, but because I've slept since then. But anyway, I think I've told you before that back some years ago, Phyllis and I were given by some good brethren that loved us and very generously. They gave us a 16-day trip to the Bible lands. And we went to Turkey and Greece and Israel and so on. And it was amazing to us when we were in Jerusalem and we were staying at the Seven Arches Hotel, and we'd get out in the morning, we'd eat breakfast and then get out and walk around a little bit before we'd get on the bus and go touring for that day. But it was amazing to us how people who were residents there would stop us and they'd say, you're from Alabama, aren't you? They didn't say you're from the United States. They'd say you're from Alabama. Well, how did you detect that, when our draws would come out? But it wasn't just Southern people. If you were from the Midwest or you from the far West, North, and you know how that is. We sometimes hear people one another talk, and some talk faster than others, and others talk slower than others. So maybe it was the speech of Jesus. I don't know. Maybe it was the dress. Maybe it was the way he talked. But she said, you're a Jew. And so, reading now again from verse 9, how is it that you, being a Jew, ask a drink from me, a Samaritan woman? Maybe she thought about that difference, the male and the female difference. Or maybe it was the Samaritan part of it. Because then she said, for Jews have no dealings with Samaritans. That's John's insert regarding her saying what she did. So Jesus answered and said to her, if you knew the gift of God and who it is who says to you, give me a drink, you would have asked him, and he would have given you living water. Now let that register, because she didn't understand it. You're going to see that she didn't. Verse 11, the woman said to him, sir, you have nothing to draw with, and the well is deep. Where then do you get that living water? Are you greater than our father Jacob? See, there's a bit of sarcasm here. And she claims descendancy from Jacob, which really wasn't accurate. Are you greater than our father Jacob, who gave us the well and drank from it himself, as well as his sons and his livestock? Jesus answered and said to her, whoever drinks of this water will thirst again. But whoever drinks of the water that I shall give him will never thirst. But the water that I shall give him will become in him a fountain of water springing up into everlasting life. Her mind was locked in on literal water out of that well. He is talking about spiritual water, water spiritually, to satisfy the need, the thirst, the quest of a person's soul. But she didn't understand that. And so the woman said, sir, give me this water that I may not thirst, nor come here to draw. See, that lets you know for certain she's talking about the literal water. And in that culture, and think back with some of the Sunday school literature that you've seen where drawings are made and somebody's at the well or headed to the well to get water, was it ever a man? It's always a woman. Woman carrying the pot. So likely she works for somebody. She lives at a house where her daily responsibility is to go get the water and bring it. So she said, if you've got water that's living water and don't ever have to have any more water, then I won't have to come out here and do this every day. But she just didn't understand yet. So Jesus said to her, go call your husband and come here. Now, why in the world would he make that request? We're not told. And if you came expecting me to tell you, you're just a bit disappointed, because all I can tell you is what the record says. And the record says he told her to go call her husband and come here. The woman answered and said, I have no husband. Now that was actually true in a sense, but not literally. Because the Bible says, you have well said, I have no husband. For you have had 5 husbands, and the one whom you now have is not your husband. In that you spoke truly. Well, do you ever use the phrase that, well, that just blows my mind? I know we use that phraseology occasionally. I think that might have been true of this woman at that point. She's thinking, she had to be thinking, what? How does he know? Because she did not yet understand who he was. And that as God in the flesh, he not only knew that she was a promiscuous woman, not only did he know that she's an adulteress, he knew exactly how many husbands she'd had. 5 of them. And he knew that right now she was living with a man without marital vows. So she's living with a 6th man. Now here's her reaction. Sir, I perceive that you are a prophet. In other words, by the fact that he knew things about her that she had not divulged to him, led her to believe he has to have divine power, which prophets would have had. So you have to be a prophet. Now, let's also analyze this in this way, and I'm not trying to read things into the text, just drawing some obvious conclusions. The woman most likely became very uncomfortable when he said, go call your husband. And in an awkward situation, if you're kind of embarrassed about something, what is one of the best tactics that you use? You change the subject. So she changed the subject. I perceive you're a prophet. Our fathers worshiped on this mountain. Now, go back, remember I held my hand up. Remember, we're in this northern part, and in the most northern part there is Mount Gerizim. Mount Ebal is south of there. And this that we're studying is in between Ebal and Gerizim. And at Gerizim, that's where the Samaritans went to worship. They believed, and if she was a faithful Samaritan woman, she had been taught most of her life at least, that that's where God got the dust to build Adam. And that's where the ark rested. They believed that that was the place They were taught to believe that was the place for them to worship, and it was a part of the rebellion against the southern kingdom, and there's stories about that, of course, in the Old Testament. But she knew that was the place to go to worship. And in fact, one thing I just failed to mention a minute ago is that their work and worship spiritually there goes all the way back to Nehemiah. And there was a temple erected on Gerizim in the days of Nehemiah. So, from her perspective, and they are incidentally, geographically, they are within sight of Gerizim. At least the southern slope of it would have come down easily in sight of Sychar. So, in my mind, I can see her standing there with Jesus and saying, now, you all believe you have to go back to Jerusalem to worship, but we go to that mountain. And she points, because it would have been easy to point to and easy to see. So that's where you all go. Well, let's see how Jesus responds to that. She said, our fathers worshiped on this mountain. That's where she points. And you Jews say that in Jerusalem is the place where one ought to worship. Jesus said to her, woman, believe me, the hour is coming when you will neither on this mountain nor in Jerusalem, which would be Mount Moriah, worship the Father. You worship what you do not know. We know what we worship, and now is when the true worshipers will worship the Father in spirit and truth, for the Father is seeking such to worship him. God is spirit, and those who worship him must worship him in spirit and truth. Did you catch what he did there? Her response was, now that's where we go to worship. But you being a Jew think we've got to go to this location. What he did in his reply was change it from a focus on the place to a focus on the person being worshiped. And that would have been an indictment against all of those Samaritans, including her, because they didn't worship Jehovah. The Samaritans had a religion that was basically, it was a mixture of idolatry and Judaism, but a perversion of Judaism. And so she said, okay, and as she changes the subject, because no doubt she would have been embarrassed or at least felt awkward about his question or his request, go get your husband and come here. So she changes it to, well, let's talk about where you worship. And he basically said, no, let's talk about who we worship. Because God is spirit. Now, to say that God is spirit is equal to saying he doesn't have the limitation of space or time. He's spirit. You ever prayed to God while you were driving? Well, if you've driven in Nashville much, you do. Have you ever prayed to God on an airplane? I have. 60, 70,000 feet up, I've prayed to him. You can pray to God anywhere because he's everywhere. He's not limited to space and time. You wake up in the middle of the night. I did last night. And my first waking thought was, I looked at the clock and I thought, it's 6 hours till I'm going to be preaching. So I talked to him. And I didn't have to go to a certain place or a certain spot on earth. That's what he's teaching her. God is spirit. And he's not material, like something that you'd make out of a piece of wood or a piece of metal or a rock. He's a living being. And he hears his people praying to him wherever they are. So Christ is telling her, it will not matter whether you're at Gerizim or Moriah. The hour is coming, and now is, when God will be worshiped in spirit and in truth, that is, with the effect of according to the truth. Whoever you are. Well, her reaction, verse 25 said, I know that Messiah is coming, who is called Christ. When he comes, he will tell us all things. Jesus said to her, I who speak to you am he. And he reveals himself to be the Messiah. Now, what her understanding of the Messiah was, we're not told. How extensive that understanding was, we're not told. She just knew that there was something about it. And by the way, those Samaritans did not accept all of the Bible, even the Old Testament, because the New Testament wasn't revealed yet. But even the Old Testament, they believed only the Pentateuch, Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. So how extensive her understanding of the Messiah might have been, we're not told. But he said, that Messiah, you're talking to him. Well, at this point, verse 27, verse 27, at this point his disciples came, and they marveled that he talked with a woman, yet no one said, what do you seek? Or why are you talking with her? They didn't dare ask him. The woman then left her water pot. She went her way into the city and said to the men, come see a man who told me all things that I ever did. Could this be the Christ? Personally, I don't think she was in doubt at this point. I believe she understood he was the Christ, but she's just sort of asking the leading question. Come see him. Could it be? Will you come find out? Could it be that he's the Christ? And then they went out of the city and came to him. In the meantime, his disciples urged him, saying, Rabbi, eat. But he said to them, I have food to eat of which you do not know. Therefore the disciples said to one another, has anyone brought him anything to eat? And Jesus said, as you heard me preach this morning, my food is to do the will of him who sent me and to finish his work. I want to expand that thought for just a moment. Have you ever been involved in some activity and get so deeply involved in it that you don't even think about its eating time? You know what our culture's like. We say, it's 12 o'clock, it's time for us to have lunch. It's not that we're hungry, it's not that we're desperately needing food, it's time for us to eat. Well, how did you get to the point that you didn't think about eating? Because you were so enveloped in what you were doing that time was not the factor. Hunger was not the factor. That's what happened right there. They said, Master, you need to eat. He said, I have food you don't know about. And so, our time is gone, but here's the rest of the story in a sentence or so. They go talk to him. That is, the men in the city of Sychar. And they believed, some of them believed her word, but then later some of them said, we now believe in him not because of her word, we now believe in him because of what he said. And that's why you and I believe what we believe. I believe my mother taught me those stories, rocking me to sleep at night. I believe that. I believe those stories. But I don't believe them because she told them to me. I believe them because she told me what the Bible says. She told me what Christ said. Let's make sure that our faith is not in men. Our faith is in those who bring us the Word of God. Now, I have another 30 minutes, but you all are hungry. It's time to go eat. So let me give you, I'll close with a thought for the week. You know I do this. This is worth repeating. Nothing personal now. Why is it that when you go to the doctor and you say, I just feel tired all the time, that the first thing the doctor does is look at your tongue? Think about it. You're dismissed. Thank you.